Recently, Dr. Michael Mina, the director of the Rapid Test Advocacy Network, as well as the MD, PhD, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, was interviewed by Dr. Sanjay Gupta on his podcast, Coronavirus Fact versus Fiction. The topic of this January podcast: where are the rapid tests? And that's a great question. We're going to play these here for you just real briefly. There's a link down in our description so you can listen to the entire 16-minute podcast. I felt the introduction was a good one to share, to just give you a little bit of taste on where are the rapid tests.
We have not yet seen a vigorous lean into these tests, despite how massively important they could be.
That's Dr. Michael Mina. He's an epidemiologist, an immunologist, and a physician at Harvard. You could say he's a man with many hats, and lately he's been a vocal advocate for widespread, rapid COVID testing. Tests that could be done at home in as little as 5 minutes.
These tools have so much promise, and people are going to have this next to their kitchen sink or next to their bathroom sink. And if your kid has a fever, you don't have to bring them to the doctor. You just pull out a little tube that says, hey, check if it's flu, RSV, or COVID, and you swab their nose or their cheek and you stick it in the box here, and a few minutes later you know what your kid's sick with.
To hear Dr. Mina describe it, these tests sound amazingly simple and amazingly useful, maybe even game-changing in terms of helping control the spread of COVID in the United States.
I really think that COVID is serving as a catalyst here for shaving 10 years off of the development of these tests to get them into the homes today, so that by 2022, I think we should all expect really the diagnostic landscape to look quite different.
For today's episode, I talked to Dr. Mina about our country's current testing strategy, the difference between testing to diagnose versus testing for public health, and what we can do to raise our testing game in the United States to the next level. I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN's chief medical correspondent, and this is Coronavirus, Fact versus Fiction.
I would say that the earliest days of this virus, we knew quite well just how transmissible it was. I mean, still, by mid-January, we had seen that the virus had moved to nearly all regions of China, to other countries in the region where it was, and that was just the detected cases. So I was also seeing the massive restrictions in testing that at that time, most epidemiologists hadn't really thought about testing as a limit to our understanding of the virus. But from my perspective, I was looking at China and a lot of these data sets saying, we're just barely touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're seeing. So if we're actually just detecting it in 8 different countries, it's probably in 20 different countries.
I want to talk about that part of things and the rollout of testing and how it went and how it's still going. But if you could, just give us a little lesson around some of the terminology for a second, because PCR tests, antigen tests for the presence of the virus. There's antibody tests for the presence of antibodies, obviously. Then they talk about these rapid tests. People oftentimes don't even know exactly what kind of test they got. But how do you simply explain these different tests?
Yeah, so the 2 biggest buckets are looking for the viral RNA, which is genetic code. And then one is actually looking for viral proteins. Let's take a crime scene. I'll describe these 2. So you have PCR, looks for genetic code, and antigen looks for proteins. If you have a crime scene and you have a detective that can go into that crime scene and find blood on the floor, they can then use PCR to detect that the crime was there. Maybe it's still happening for all we know, but also they can detect the DNA long after the crime had been committed. So that's PCR. It just needs remnant RNA. But antigen tests, which look for the proteins of the virus, actually need to see the real virus in action. They need to see it there. And I liken an antigen test more to a security guard. They're there to see the crime in action right then and there. If the crime's been committed already, that's when you call in the forensics detective. If it hasn't been committed already and it's going on right now, both tests could potentially work, but the security guard is probably a really good one.
And then the antigen tests, are those typically interchangeably called rapid tests?
Yeah, so I call them rapid tests quite often because antigen tests, they don't need a machine to sort of do a molecular reaction. They usually are direct detection. I'm holding one. I know people listening won't see this, but what I'm holding here is just a little strip of paper, and it's essentially got some lines on it, and one line means that you're negative, and 2 lines mean you're positive for the antigen test. And this shows up, the lines will show up in about 5 to 10 minutes. And it's very, very simple to use. You just swab the front of your nose, put that swab in a little tube of buffer, and drop this piece of paper into the tube. And just like a pregnancy test, it shows a line. So it's very, very quick, usually between 5 and 30 minutes, depending on the brand.
If you're doing a PCR test, the polymerase chain reaction test, you're taking a sample and then there's some sort of amplification of the material so that if there's even a little bit of this genetic material, this viral RNA, you're likely to catch it. The wrap on antigen test seems to be that you're not really amplifying. You may miss it, and therefore the false negative, saying that you are negative and you're not, you're in fact positive, that's going to be a bigger concern with these antigen tests. Is that true, and is it a big concern?
It's true, and it's not a big concern if you're using the test as a public health tool. And what I mean by that is you can have a test, and a test might be applied by a physician to know if your patient's symptoms are due to COVID. So if I have a patient who comes to me and says, "Doc, I've been feeling crappy for 2 weeks, and I just want to know if I have COVID," then as a physician dealing with this one patient, I want to know if they have any remnant virus. I want to do everything I can, just like a forensics detective, to know, is there a current infection, or maybe was there an infection last week? Now, if I switch my hats and I put on my public health hat, I want to say, I don't care if somebody was infectious 2 weeks ago. I want to know, is the person who I'm testing today needing isolation today? And that's where these tests really shine. They will be positive when somebody's contagious, for the most part. There's a small window of time for a few hours beforehand when PCR might be positive, but the antigen test will be negative. But that window of time is short, say 5, 8, 10 hours. So all of the concern that you're raising, which is that there's been a massive amount of concern that maybe these are missing cases, it's almost always after people are infectious. And that's because after you're infectious, you could think you just went through this massive battle. You had trillions of viruses in your nose growing, and your immune system beat it down. And essentially what is left on that battlefield is a tremendous amount of viral RNA that takes potentially weeks or months to clear. So the PCR will keep picking it up, but you're no longer infectious. So these tests don't detect there. So that is what mistakes people. They think that the antigen test is low sensitivity, but really it's doing exactly its job.
You can listen to the full podcast on Dr. Sanjay Gupta's website or on iTunes. Look for Coronavirus Fact versus Fiction. It was January 19th, 2021. The title is Where Are the Rapid Tests? Appreciate you listening. Have a good day. Thank you.